Chapter 22. The Archive. The warmth of the entryway vanished as Pontificus Gordon pushed the oak doors open and stepped out into the snowy night. The hawk paid no attention to the chill, nor to the swirling clouds his breath made. He'd lived in the mountains since childhood, had spent his entire adult life here at Fort Safehaven. He could handle the cold, yet he allowed himself a shiver. Now that he was outside, not observed by anyone save perhaps the guards along the rooftop 4 stories up, he felt no need to suppress his emotion. He wasn't afraid of what was happening. He was angry. Angry that it had come to this. Angry that President Brisk refused to help, that Lady Claythorne refused to listen. Of course, it was neither his job nor his right to make demands of her. He was an advisor, not an official. A glorified errand boy entering the last quarter of his life, and he'd watched these changes happen slowly, bit by bit, one little compromise after another, until Fort Safehaven was almost unrecognizable from the Sentinel City it had once been. The ranks of Safehaven were compromised. He'd seen it happening. And now, who could say who their friends were? Or who could be trusted? He strode across the stone esplanade and toward the descending snowbank. In the distance below, the lights of Pine Creek twinkled like yellow stars against the night. So peaceful, a perfect postcard of a town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It didn't look like the setting for a murder, let alone 5. The 5th had been only 2 days ago. This victim was the youngest yet, hardly a man, and they were all the same species. Why? His thoughts were interrupted by a mechanical grinding sound. It came from the trees just down the slope from where he stood. He knew that sound. The guard along the rooftop was pacing in the opposite direction. Gordon hesitated, thinking to gain the guard's attention. But reckless anger got the better of him, and he turned again toward the noise. Drawing the cloak around himself, he started off down the hill. The snow was deeper than he'd expected, and he nearly lost his balance as he sank knee-deep. Righting himself, he trudged toward the growth of evergreens, beyond which that mechanical grind could still be heard. It was dark in the midst of the trees, cut off from the moon and the lights of the fort. Somehow, the mechanical sound seemed much louder in here. It was getting closer. Indeed, he could see the yellow lights, like the glowing eyes of some giant beast, moving between the trees ahead. They bobbed up and down as the machine stomped slowly through the glade, right toward him. Heart pounding, he squinted against the headlights, trying to make out the shaded figure of the machine's pilot. And then his stomach plummeted. It was a sinking feeling, a realization. He was being watched, not from the front, but from the side. He spun to the left, taking a step backward. A bleach-white skull reflected the light of the moon. He, or it, stood in a clearing, a cloak of fur billowing out to one side like a tattered flag. Long, bull-like horns extended from either side of the skull, its round sockets like big black coins. And in its skeletal fingers, the monstrous creature clutched a burlap sack. "We've been waiting for you, Mr. Gordon," said a wheezing voice. There was something broken, wrong in the sound of it. Gordon, a war veteran, thought it sounded like words spoken through a punctured lung, and it seemed to be coming from the burlap sack. He turned to see the machine pass between the trees to his right. It was only yards away now, a great 4-legged tank with a cage at the front, and behind the bars of the cage he could just make out the face of the pilot. "You," he said, his voice cold, his blood boiling. The pilot cranked his arms forward, and the machine lunged. The horned creature made no move, empty sockets staring blankly as Gordon screamed. "Move over! I want to see! Hey, stop shoving! Wow, he doesn't even look hurt!" Jack opened his eyes. A dozen faces were peering down at him. Disoriented, his head pounding, he was nonetheless relieved to see that the faces were all kids, apprentices. "Ah, you're awake," Sprint said, looking down at him with a combination of relief and reverence. "Had us worried there. We thought you'd been poisoned or something." "Poisoned?" Jack said, pushing himself to a sitting position and rubbing the space between his ears. He looked around. He was on his bed in the barracks. Morning light showed in through the window between bunk beds. "Is it true?" asked a goat boy named Burson. "Did you really fight Petrillo?" "Does he look like he fought Petrillo?" another boy responded. "Well, he chased Petrillo for sure," said a girl. "Tanya and I saw him." "And he tried to break into the president's car," Sprint added impressively. "Sprint!" Jack yelled, his heart leaping. "Don't worry," Sprint muttered. "They love it. You're like a hero now." Jack looked around uncertainly at the faces beaming down at him. "Why would you try to break into the president's car?" the same girl asked. She was a pretty mouse, maybe a little older than Jack, with large round ears and fur of a soft brown. His cheeks burned. "I didn't. I fell onto it from his house." Some gasped. Others exchanged glances. One boy whistled, impressed. Cal was hovering near the edge of the crowd. Jack caught his eye, and the groundhog turned away, shaking his head in disgust. His team followed as he left the room. "So what was he like?" Burson asked. "Was he strong? Did he have any powers?" "Who says it's a he?" a fox girl said, looking Burson up and down. "Petrillo's a guy name," Burson said. "If it was a girl, it'd be Petrilla." "Wait, he's up?" called an angry voice from beyond the crowd. Kids were pushed sideways as Maddie forced her way to the edge of Jack's bed. "What in the all-fours world were you thinking, Jack?" she bellowed. "Do you have any idea how much damage you could have done?" The crowd began to shuffle awkwardly away. "We're being evaluated as a team," she continued. "Everything you do, every stupid little boneheaded idea reflects on all 5 of us. If one of us messes up, we're all out of here. Thank God you weren't caught. Thank God we didn't get thrown out of here today. It was that close." "He's fine, Maddie," Sprint said. "We're all fine. He didn't get caught, and we're no longer the laughingstock of the apprentices. Wins all around." Maddie glared at him. "And if he had been caught?" Sprint shrugged. "We'd be sent home. But if a rock fell from the sky and flattened us, we'd be dead. It didn't happen, so who cares?" "This time. It didn't happen this time." "You mean getting caught?" Sprint asked. "No, you guys getting flattened by a rock," she said as she stalked away. "But there's still hope." There was a faint buzzing sound. "Someone's pager's going off," a boy called. "The light is red. What does that mean?" "It means none of your business," Willie answered, grabbing the pager from him and looking down at the screen. "Detail," he said. Sprint groaned. "Man, I hate detail." "What are you complaining about?" Willie said. "You could finish the job for all of us in 5 minutes." Jack laughed, which made Sprint shoot him an angry glance. "Well, he has a point," Jack said. "I mean, a job where all we have to do is dust and polish? That's a walk in the park for you." Trapped between annoyance and flattery, Sprint simply shrugged. "It's boring, though." "Not today it won't be," Maddie replied, taking the pager from Willie and reading it. Her tone had changed from anger to excitement. "We're detailing the archive." "The archive?" Hoover said, stopping with one arm in his sweater. "I mean, the archive? Oh, man, I've always wanted to check it out." "Okay, nerd," Sprint said. "What's the archive?" "It's where they keep all the historic, significant stuff from Animal Control's past," Hoover explained, his eyes wide as he finished with the sweater. "It's like a big museum filled with costumes, vehicles, weapons, everything." "A museum?" Sprint said. You're excited about dusting historic stuff in a museum." "I don't know," Hoover mumbled. "It could be fun." Jack threw his arms up to shield himself as Maddie tossed the pager at him rather aggressively. Picking it up, he unclasped the messenger bag at his feet and dropped the pager inside. His eyes caught something else in there. After making sure the others were occupied, he lifted the bag to his lap and peeked inside. There, sitting among the papers, pens, and pamphlets he'd accumulated over the past several weeks, was the heart-shaped key. The archive was a large steel building, the arched shape of an airplane hangar. It glinted in the morning sunlight, its great hangar doors pushed wide. Standing at the entrance was a plump mole in a maroon cardigan. "Hello there," the mole said, her face squashing into a good-natured grin. "My name is Rose. Welcome to the archive." "That's Pitfall," Hoover whispered, a familiar starstruck tone in his voice. "She's a legend, retired 10 years ago." "Now," the mole said, clapping her paws together and squinting slightly over their heads, "the archive is where we preserve some of Animal Control's history. Today, my little historians, we're going to learn a bit about that history, all while helping to preserve it." "Lucky little ducks," Sprint muttered, mimicking her sing-song tone. "As you all know," Pitfall continued, "Animal Control was founded over 40 years ago. We had just won the war against the Red Teeth, thanks almost entirely to one man." She turned and motioned for them to follow her as she passed through the tall hangar doors. They entered a green-carpeted lobby decorated in flags and glass displays. Near the inner doors stood a bronze statue of a lion with a dreadlocked mane. "King of Hearts," Pitfall continued, "was only a teen during the New Famine War. He was a soldier, one of the last survivors of the Battle of Pretty Fishes." She stood before the statue, her paws clasped in front of her. The story goes his squad was hiding in a foxhole. They were exhausted, injured, and out of ammunition. A red-teeth soldier spotted them, and before they could react, a tank was poking its cannon straight in at them. Then King, Aaron Harding I should say, did something amazing. He grabbed the cannon with both paws and shoved it out of the hole. Just pushed it right out, then followed after it. Something had changed in him, some power discovered. She paused, looking between them. "Can anyone tell me what caused this change?" Sprint nudged Hoover with an elbow. "This guy knows." The mole gave Hoover an encouraging smile. "Do you?" Looking anxiously between the two of them, Hoover hesitated, then nodded. "In extremis manifestation?" he half whispered. "He was near death. That's why his powers manifested." "Precisely," Pitfall said, her face once again squashing into a smile. "For some, Hytena will not show up until the body needs it. It was at that moment, when he was about to die, that he discovered his power. And not just any power, the Alpha Hytena, which hadn't been seen in a century. The story goes that his eyes began to glow red, his feet left the ground, and he hovered around that battlefield, crumpling tanks with his bare paws, causing the earth to swallow red-teeth soldiers, calling the very roots of trees to bind his enemies. He took that field, then the next. Within days, the tide had shifted. Within weeks, the war was over." Jack was transfixed, staring at the statue, imagining the glowing red eyes, the hovering body. He must have been terrifying. And then he realized something else. Dr. Walraven must have been there, must have seen that change in his friend. Without meaning to, he began stroking the falcon emblem stitched into his messenger bag. "When the war was over," Pitfall continued, gesturing for the group to follow as she pulled open one half of the double doors and walked through, "King realized that his protection wouldn't be enough. He would need to find others like himself and unite them. I myself was the 3rd officer King recruited." They entered an enormous room, 5 stories tall and punched with skylights along its curved roof. Display cases formed a pathway that moved to the left. As Pitfall spoke, she gestured toward the cases, their shelves filled with all sorts of animal control memorabilia, medals, framed photographs, even weaponry. The walls of memories weaved through what Jack quickly realized was a sort of museum and trophy room all in one. The mole pointed upward. "Here are the remains of the Leviathan, defeated by Sudflood 12 years ago." An enormous bleach-white skeleton was suspended overhead. It reminded Jack of a whale skeleton he had seen in one of Dr. Walraven's books, only this one was longer, skinnier, and had a head more similar to a jagged-toothed crocodile. Further ahead, they passed a wall of mannequins dressed in colorful, rather old-fashioned costumes, some of which Jack recognized. A female mannequin, sculpted to resemble a slender cat, wore a purple and black outfit with a yellow R patch on the chest. That was Retract. She had been on the front page of one of the newspapers in Jack's childhood collection. A much larger mannequin, a big-bellied hippopotamus, wore the kind of mask a wrestler might wear. Jack couldn't think of his name. The Murphy or something. "And here," the mole said, coming to a stop, "is your assignment for today." Jack looked ahead, and his stomach plummeted. They had come to an open, circular space, at the center of which sat the crumpled-nosed engine of an S-train. The S-train. "You might recognize S-530 here," Pitfall said, standing before it with her paws folded in front of her. "This is the train engine that ended King's life. We keep it here as a reminder. None of us is perfect. We must always, always be ready for the worst." She began to walk around the chained perimeter of the display. "But, as you can see, old 530 could use a little spit and polish. For the next 2 hours, you'll be scrubbing her down. This way, I'll show you the supply room." When they had gathered their dust rags and spray bottles, Pitfall left them to it. "All right, Hooves," Sprint said, tossing his rag over his shoulder and turning to the anteater. "All right what?" Hoover asked. "All right, do your stuff." Nonplussed, Hoover raised an eyebrow. "Just, Sprint explained, wagging his paw toward the engine. "Bust the dust." When Hoover looked even more confused, Sprint rolled his eyes. "You can save us all a ton of work here." Catching on, Hoover looked nervously toward the engine. "This is a precious piece of animal control history. I'll blow it up." "You gotta learn to use your low settings sometime. Why not now?" "I'm not a blow dryer," Hoover said. "I don't have high and low settings." Personally, Jack wished Hoover could blow it clean. The sight of the mangled engine was unsettling to him. The idea of touching it made him queasy. As the others got to work, he walked around it, looking for an area that didn't hold a secret history between him and the train engine. Sprint had insisted that they keep no secrets. Well, here was the biggest one, the granddaddy secret of all time. He, Jack, was the reason King of Hearts was dead. As he passed around the back, examining the gaping hole where it had once joined with the passenger cars, he could practically hear his own small voice. "King, please help me!" And the ghost of King's voice echoed back.
"Take my paw! Quickly!"
Jack continued around the train, but stopped short of the front wheels, which were bent inward beneath the crumpled section of the body. He looked away, afraid he'd find some fleck of brownish red, some clump of golden fur caught in the iron folds. He diverted his eyes to a door along the body of the train. The bottom of it was higher than the tip of his ears. He remembered that door being flung open. He remembered the pig grabbing him by his ears and tossing him out into the rain. His eyes moved down to the silver plank-like object, protruding like an injured wing just above the wheels. It looked like a panel from a set of hanging blinds, only it was made of metal, so shiny Jack could see his own distorted reflection looking back at him. He reached forward, sliding his paw along the thin edge. It was surprisingly sharp, This was the section that had caught his shirt collar. It had saved his life. But as he bent lower to examine it, there was something else. Some vague memory, like a word balancing on the tip of the tongue. The underside of the train. He didn't know why, but as he looked at the dark metal pipes and bolts, some feeling of recollection blossomed. Why was the underside of the train so familiar? He was so lost in thought he hadn't heard Sprint approaching and jumped at the sight of him. He winced as his paw scraped the edge of the mirror-like fin branch. Boo?" Sprint said. Jack frowned down at his paw. A small patch of red was growing on the largest of his pads. "Youch!" Sprint grimaced. "I saw a first aid kit in the supply room." He jerked his head in that direction. Jack gave a final look at the base of the train, then followed. "You know, I still don't understand how you did it," Sprint said. He leaned against the wall and watched Jack dab at his wounded paw. "Did what?" Jack responded, tossing the bloodied cloth into a garbage bin, then peeling open a bandage. "Got through the maze so quickly," Sprint said. "I mean, you didn't even seem to try. It's like you knew where you were going." Jack didn't immediately respond. In the 6 weeks since the trial, he had thought about this very thing quite a bit. The apprentice teams had spent many nights, especially in the first few weeks, talking about the trials. It always surprised Jack to hear how difficult the maze had been for most of them. "It just seemed unfair," Burson, the goat boy, had complained. "I mean, I spent the entire 15 minutes just wandering aimlessly." This was true for most everyone, it seemed. The ones who solved the maze were either flyers or climbers, those who could reach the top of the maze and solve it from there, or runners like Sprint, who solved it by simply trying every possibility. Jack seemed to be the only one who hadn't found the maze difficult. Why was that? Before he could voice an answer, however, his messenger bag began to buzz. He flipped it open. "It can't be time to leave," he said. "It's not even noon." Sprint shook his head, watching with stiff anticipation. Fishing among the papers, Jack peeked into the bag. The interior was now flooded with green light. Breath caught in his chest. He withdrew the pager and read the screen. Annex launch 99. "It's green," Sprint said, stunned. "Annex launch? But what do you think 99 means?" Jack stared at the pager in his paw, disbelieving. "Code 99. It means bring a suitcase."